Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this first Tocqueville on Discourse event, the first event of the academic year. My name is Brent Nelson, and I am the director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society and a member of the Department of Politics and International Affairs. As I look out, I see students and faculty and OLLI students. Do you call yourselves OLLI students? Yeah? Okay. Continuing education, so they're students. And, of course, members of the community. We're very glad all of you are here. Tocqueville Center events are open to the Furman community and to the public. If you like what you see here, invite your roommates and neighbors and friends. We have an exciting lineup of speakers this year who will be speaking to important and timely topics. Make sure you take one of those brochures that you got at the door. Take as many as you need, as long as you're going to hand them out to people who might want to attend. And you can look for yourself and see what kind of speakers we have lined up. Use the QR codes in the brochure or click on the one that's up here, and you can go directly to the Tocqueville website, where you'll find lots of additional information on our activities. Now here I want to apologize to those of you who were with us last night, because you'll have heard some of this already, but I need to introduce the Tocqueville Center to everyone in the room. The Tocqueville Center fosters serious inquiry into the moral and political questions at the heart of democratic life. Through curricular and extracurricular programs, we invite students, faculty, and the Furman community to engage seriously with diverse and competing religious, political, and ethical traditions. We want to expose the community, as Matthew Arnold often said, to the best that has been thought and said in the world. In addition, we uphold free inquiry as essential to education and civic life, recognizing that a just society remains open to examination of its deepest assumptions. Alexis de Tocqueville, the 19th century French aristocrat, social scientist, philosopher, politician, and world traveler, is one of the great minds of the past who addressed many of these big questions. His classic book, Democracy in America, for instance, asks how a commitment to social equality changes the nature of society and the way it is governed. His answers shed light on deep truths about early America and its pioneering people, and his predictions proved prescient. If this project excites you, let me tell you about some of the ways you can be involved in the Tocqueville Center. First, the Tocqueville Fellows are Furman students chosen in the spring, so you can apply in the spring, for membership the following year. These 25 undergraduates from many majors spend the year reading and discussing the works of Tocqueville and other great thinkers, as well as the writings of the speakers we bring in during the year. They eat dinner with the speakers, they write opinion pieces for the website, and of course, they do the ushering here at CLPs. Second, I'm excited to announce a brand new group. Okay, I will announce the brand new group. There we go. This new group we established this year, and it's called the Beaumont Forum. Now, Gustave de Beaumont was Alexis de Tocqueville's friend who accompanied him on his trip to America. This group is open to all Furman students who wish to be more involved with the center but want to devote less time to Tocqueville activities than the fellows. They get special seats at CLPs and will engage when they can in post-lecture discussions. And there will also be food. If you want more information, please click on this QR code and join our list, and you'll find out more about what you can be involved in the near future. Finally, Furman's lifelong learning program called OLLI has a Tocqueville special interest group for interested community members. If you're an OLLI member, I encourage you to join the Tocqueville SIG to dig deeper into the topics explored in the speaker series And Al and Mary Jo are right over there. Just raise your hands a little bit. They're your people to talk to after the talk tonight. Tonight we're in for a treat. This being an on-discourse event, Professor Lilla will be giving a short presentation and then getting those of us in the audience to participate in the discussion. Being on discourse, however, means a bit of housekeeping. First, I need you, first, these are the community agreements that we all agree to as participants in On Discourse. The core principles are the most important to think about. Reflect on your own biases, listen attentively, then speak for yourself, apologize if necessary, extend grace, address objections in a way that allows a response, and use good argumentation. Those are just good principles of civil discourse. And that's what we want to have tonight. And there we go. There's the pre-event ODI survey. Many of you have already done things like this for other on-discourse events. So if you can, it's a very short survey. We just need a little information from you at the beginning. And all of it is anonymous. Okay. Now, let me introduce our speaker and discussion leader, and we will get going tonight. Professor Mark Lilla is professor of the Humanities at Columbia University. Before that, he taught in the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago and at New York University. He earned his AB at the University of Michigan and MPP and PhD at Harvard University. Professor Lilla is a superb scholar and well-known public intellectual. He is the author of many books, including The Once and Future Liberal, After Identity Politics, The Shipwrecked Mind on Political Reaction, and The Stillborn God, Religion, Politics, and the Modern West. His latest book is titled Ignorance and Bliss, on Wanting Not to Know. He is a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, Liberties, and publications worldwide. His list of fellowships, invited lectures, and awards is long and illustrious. You can read about them and learn more about Professor Lilla in the brochure. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Mark Lilla.
I'm going to turn this up.
Turn it up.
Yeah.
I think it's done over here.
Testing.
As far
Is that
as I
better?
can tell, it's up as
I'm just having trouble hearing. Now I hear myself.
Okay.
All right. A year ago, I moved from a rather spacious apartment in Park Slope, Brooklyn, with a basement and little cubby holes everywhere, back to Manhattan, into a very nice two-bedroom apartment with no storage space in the basement. And so the task that faced me this past year is trying to squeeze 15 years of living in a big place into a new place. And after a long time of, a long period of throwing things out, my wife asked the sister of a friend of hers, who it turns out is a professional organizer, one of these people who come, like Marie Kenda, or whatever her name is, right? Tell you how to organize your life. And she comes over and she looks at our stuff, and the first thing she says is, boxes. Everything has to go in a box. And so she orders a bunch of boxes that come, and we spend a few days just trying to sort these things that had all been fitted into this big closet. Now, imagine the following scenario, which did not quite happen, but could have. I take one of these boxes and I put into it a watch that doesn't work, 2 dried up apricots, a belt, a stapler, and a Sony Walkman that does work. And I hand it to my wife and say, you put the label on it. Imagine her perplexity. She has no context that would allow her to put a label on this. And to me, it would be perfectly obvious. Stuff in my dorm room desk that I took out in 1978. It's perfectly obvious to me. But it's not obvious to her. Because any kind of grouping, any kind of boxing of things and putting labels on things is pure convention. And it's a purely pragmatic exercise. There are times when we have boxes in our lives, and they can be stuff, or they can be ideas, they can be thoughts, that at one time seem to belong together, and then over time you realize, well, actually half of this stuff belongs in one kind of box, and the other stuff belongs in another, and they require different labels. The same thing is true of political nomenclature. The words that we attach to particular political ideologies, parties, movements, and so on. And there's a history that can be written about each of the terms that at every period in modern history, ideological periods, where these terms come up, and some of them come up and then they disappear because they no longer apply in a way that makes sense to us pragmatically. So the term Whig, W-H-I-G, no longer makes any sense to us. It's no longer a category. Well, I want to talk about 4 categories that that we use. It may turn into 6 for a reason, but let's just take 4. 4 terms that we use all the time: liberal, conservative, reactionary, progressive. Now, what do we mean by these terms? Our instinct, if we haven't thought about it, is to think about, well, what is the essence of conservatism, right? What is the essence of progress? Or we might use the terms right and left. What's the future of the left? But these are all terms that, again, are just sticky labels on boxes, yeah? But these are the boxes we have right now. And let me submit to you that over the past 50 years, that the things in our boxes have gotten so mixed up that it's very difficult to make out what makes them cohere, why the things in them belong together. So I'm going to propose a way of using these terms, liberal, conservative, progressive, reactionary, that to me might help clarify things. So let me do it in this way. Imagine that for these 4 terms we have 2 pairs. And so imagine there's a liberal and there's a conservative over here, and there is a progressive and a reactionary here. Reactionary has a negative connotation. There's no reason why it has to, as I'll explain in a minute. Now, one way that I think makes sense to distinguish these 2 pairs is that, let me assert this, is that liberals and conservatives are interested in and have different views about human nature and the nature of human social interaction. Those are the things they think about and dispute over. Progressives and reactionaries, on the other hand, are interested in history. They're interested in whether history is moving in a certain direction, whether that's a good direction, whether there's been a break in history. If so, how can we understand that? How, if we want to, could we bring about another break in history? Those are the things those 2 people talk about. And I'll explain a little more about what they talk about in those two pairs. But I want to insist on this difference because, for example, today, there are people who the terms liberal and progressive go together often, and the terms conservative and reactionary, at least by anti-conservatives, go together in a way that I don't find that for me makes very mixed boxes. So let's look at liberalism and conservatism. I think one can use these terms to distinguish two different pictures of human nature and the relation of individual society. Let's begin with conservatives. So one way in which people use the term conservative is to talk about a view of society as somehow an organic whole, and as individuals, we are born into a pre-existing world, that it has a kind of organic wholeness. We are socialized in that, and we become individuals within the context of a social whole from which we cannot separate ourselves. And given that this is an organic whole, things are very connected, it means that it's very hard to rationalize everything in this society. It's very hard to imagine making rational changes in it because you've got a mechanism that's, with all these connected parts. And certainly as a practical matter, it would be wise to change things slowly. But also organic societies change in time. They're never fixed. But left on their own, they move and change in a slow and kind of healthy way. Let me imagine, now let me contrast that with what I'll call a liberal view of these things. A liberal might say, well, all well and good, but when it, from a moral standpoint, in particular, the individual is prior to the society. It's very important that even though the individual does not exist prior to society in temporal terms, that the individual is kind of the point of society to create certain sorts of individual, and it's the health and well-being of individuals that ought to concern us. Also argue that, in fact, the problem with conservatism is that it underestimates the degree to which we actually can set out on our own, make rational changes in our lives and our societies, and also make changes in society without threatening the very existence of the society. So that while conservatives may understand something important when it comes to the organic nature of society, their conservativeness, their conservatism, makes them misunderstand what you can do in politics and the kind of freedom and autonomy individuals can have. So a debate between them would be a debate over human nature, social nature. Now imagine another discussion. Let's say we have someone who says that he or she is a progressive, and what they say is that if you look at history, now notice I never mentioned history in talking about liberals and conservatives, but if you look at history, you will see that over time, the story of history is the story of the progressive emancipation of human beings from domination, the gradual increase in our capacity to understand nature and the universe, and an increased capacity to act autonomously and to find our own happiness. But this is a historical process. And political activity is to be understood as good political activity advances that. And if things are stuck, And nothing will change, perhaps even a revolution is necessary in order that history reach the end towards which it's pointing. Now, you've all studied enough political theory to know people you might put in that, in that category, certain kind of Marxists and so on, right? Now is kind of tech futurists you could probably put in there. Then imagine a contrary view. That view says, oh no, it's not been a history of progress. Rather, there was a fall in history. Modernity happened. That at a certain point, human beings turned from a healthy social life with a healthy traditional society where everyone brushed their teeth and went to church, and then something demonic happened. And those who wrote against the French Revolution talked about it as a demonic act. And since then, ever since we've gotten away from tradition, religion, family, the basic texts, whatever little list you come up with, history has been moving in a negative way. Therefore, if we're to have a healthy society again, we must seize control of history. Either by going back to the status quo ante, let's all go back to our back porches and live in small communities and homeschool our children and all those good things. Or if that's not possible, what's needed is a counter-revolution to create a new society that will be like a rebirth of this older society, but stronger, more muscular, more heroic, right? And you can imagine or think a little bit historically examples of that. At an extreme, fascism is one of them, right? That fascism was both backward-looking and forward-looking. It was about creating a society in the future that was a kind of muscular, buffed-up version of the past. All right, so wherever you stand on each of those, these questions, the way I've laid it out is to highlight, to highlight for my purposes, not just the distinction between liberals and conservatives and progressives and reactionaries, but to talk about the difference between these two approaches to thinking about politics at all. Is our fundamental orientation derived from a reading of human nature, ahistorically, or is it derived from a reading of history, and either wanting to hasten it, create the good revolution, the good society, or reverse the catastrophe that's happened in modern history? So, I now ask you to take a couple minutes with the people around you. Just talk about it for a second, and then talk about whether you would consider yourself a liberal, a conservative, a reactionary, a progressive, or whether the categories don't make sense. And then we'll circle back and then we'll have a discussion. How's that? Okay, you've had a while to speak about these things. I guess I have some questions for you just to get the discussion going among us. Let me first say that, as you might have surmised, I put myself through this exercise and have written a bit about it in order to make sense of two sorts of people who are on the political scene today. One sort calls himself, or herself, I'll just say himself a liberal, but in the name of progress, thinks that certain liberal principles, such as free speech, exchange of views, toleration, and so on, need to be limited or ignored in the name of a necessary historical progress at our moment in order to keep human progress going. The other type of person is the person who is a conservative, wears a bow tie. We'll talk to you about Edmund Burke and all the rest, but we'll tell you that, and that's not you, and we'll tell you that modernity is the problem. That from the time of the Enlightenment, we've unleashed an intellectual beast that is destroying our customs, our morals. You can see it everywhere. You can see it, what's happening in the family. You can see it on television. A cultural class has taken over, and now they have created the society and they're conserving it. So in a sense, they're conservatives, but because we find this so distasteful and a disaster that we have to wage a culture war in order to either restore a prior state of health or move to a new one so that we have a society that's worth being conservative about again, right? Both sorts of people seem to me very confused. And maybe we're just all confused because we all have views about human nature, we all have views about history. But I'm wondering a couple of questions. One is, how useful did you find it to separate these sorts of things out? What did you feel it captured? What do you think it missed? And then true confessions. Now that you've been through this exercise with your friends, do you think it's revealed something about your own politics, your intuitions about politics that you might not have seen before? So who'd like to get us started? All the way in the back.
Do I just
You
use my
stand
voice?
up.
We actually do have a microphone,
Oh.
and we only have one, so we'll have to pass it around.
Do you want to sit up front from now on where you can pass it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello, does this work?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it's my impression that the distinction made between reactionary thought and progressive thought is a bit of a false dichotomy. I come at things from a Marxist perspective, but I don't think that a Marxist perspective is necessarily an optimistic one. We want to talk about progress. A Marxist would in fact say that history does follow a sort of progression. I don't think it is. I think that what this means to a Marxist is that any age of history, whether it represents an attempt at a return to the past or an unambiguous reach for the future, any era of human history is entirely unprecedented. That even a fascist epoch would only, represent, the self-consciousness of a dying age in a new context. So, extending that logic, looking at current events, it doesn't necessarily seem to me that we're moving toward certain destruction or toward some kind of paradise. The people who, you want to look at it from a Marxist perspective, the people who live under feudalism would not have been able to predict the economic developments that would destroy the social ties that characterized their age, the institutions and all of that. Likewise, it's not possible for us to predict whether, say the bourgeois class will continuously gain and lose awareness of its own position, and keep, humanity in kind of a persistent state of flux, or whether proletarian class consciousness will liberate humanity. It's not clear whether if proletarian class consciousness liberates humanity, that some sort of something more resembling to an aristocratic organization of things wouldn't emerge from that. In fact, I would advocate that it should emerge from that. Moreover, I think that people who are either progressives or reactionaries, I suppose in my case I'm somewhere amongst these two things. People who are either progressive or reactionaries are capable of participating in political conversations also as either conservatives or liberals. Depending on these conversations, I think we're ultimately talking about the same sorts of issues, but we're using different language. So, for instance, you could call Marx, in addition to saying, you would say that he's a progressive. You could say also that he is a conservative. Marx wrote somewhere that, that men make their own history, but not as they choose. He would have seen the development of history as an organic, involuntary process. Or take somebody like Nietzsche. Nietzsche wouldn't have made such a distinction between an organic process and the felt sense of agency. Agency, it's my opinion that agency, the felt sense of agency, is best understood as the expression of an organic process. So, I think there are multiple false dichotomies at play between liberals and conservatives, one, and with the idea that one is either of one of two categories or of another, or one of another two categories.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I mean, that was such a good, clear statement of the problem, and certainly of a certain understanding or interpretation of Marxism that makes it difficult to fit into these categories. So thank you so much. That was brilliant. I got to press you for a minute, though, if you just stand up, just so I can get clearer on where you stand on a couple things. As you know, and very well you imply, but I want to bring out, the whole question of agency is really the crux of, well, there's two cruxes of the matter, if you like. One is, what does it mean as a self-conscious actor today with subjectivity, in the sense that I can say I'm going to drop this or I'm not going to drop this, right? Similarly, I choose whether to devote my energies to one kind of political activity or another kind of political activity or no political activity. And if I do that with some kind of, to my mind, rational end. I posit an end towards which my action will be intelligible and become necessary, right? Now, as you know quite well, a problem within Marxism has always been, well, how much control do we have over this process? And if it is more of an inevitable process, why do we as free agents, to the extent that we are or think of ourselves in, why should we or should not engage in activity? And why should we think that the next stage of history is going to be in any way an improvement? You use the term that if the proletariat were to come into power, that they would liberate us, you said, I believe, right? But that implies an improvement of the situation, right? And so somehow this whole process that has led up to the proletariat coming into power, however crisis-filled and problematic all that was, what's supposed to pop out at the end is something that is emancipatory. Because emancipatory better, you would have to argue about that. And down that path, you end up with Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto talking about fishing in the morning, criticizing the afternoon, and all the rest. So I'm not going to ask you to have to respond because we have to go to the people. I just want to point out that when we face a challenge of having to describe what you see as our capacity for free action in this, why we should act in one way or another, given some kind of emancipatory aim, and then how one would, apart from history, defend that emancipatory aim, not just as, well, that's what happens, but it's something that's better than what existed before. I forget what the other crux was, but I'll leave it with one crux. We do need to move on, but if you want to say one thing in response, feel welcome.
Yeah, I'll say one thing. I don't think to say that the proletarian uprising would be a desirable thing is necessarily to say that it is in any sense morally good, or that it wouldn't appear, that even the end product wouldn't appear brutal to our sensibilities. In fact, I think that the reason you don't see class consciousness the way that Marx believed it would emerge is because it would have to result from the absolute destruction, the absolute degradation of all remaining sentimentality, of any like heretofore prevalent value. So on the one, I don't think I'm proposing necessarily that it would be in the traditionally thought of sense a progression. To your other point about agency, I guess to build upon this, I don't think that good and evil necessarily have anything to do with political ends.
But you have been using value-laden language the entire time you've been talking.
That doesn't necessarily mean I'm making moral judgments, I don't think.
Oh, okay, well, that would be another discussion then. But really, thank you so much for that. What a great way to start. Right up front here.
Sorry, it's really hard to follow that one up.
Never follow, yeah, right, never follow a child's act or a dog act on stage, because, the sentiments of the audience have already been exhausted, so good luck.
I was just hoping, or wondering if you could clarify just a little bit more about liberalism and conservatism. From the way I was understanding it when you first spoke about it, I was thinking that liberalism was a bit more individual comes before society, and conservative society comes before individual. So perhaps conservatives would be more, they would like policies that would deal with society, which then they would hope would trickle down to the individual, and liberals would want policy more focused on the individual that they would hope to come up to society. Is that a correct interpretation of what you were saying, or?
Yeah, that's fair enough, and you can see how you might, exaggerate these views to bring out the contrast more. So in a very radically conservative view, you could argue that individuals, there are no such things really as individuals. It's not like we pop out of thin air, right? That really we are just instances of our society. We're not a collective of individuals, but rather you're an instance of American society. You're an entrance, in a fundamental sense, an instant of it, right? And so we're all just cases of it. And from that point of view then, the priority, both practical and moral, is to make sure the mechanism is working, and that the claims of one individual who no longer thinks of himself or herself as just an instant of the society embedded in some important way might cause problems if an ideology of individualism were to take hold. Right, and so that's a conservative side. Was there something on the liberal side, or did I forget already?
I think I was just saying that would then, like, individuals, or liberalism be more kind of friendly towards policies that would then kind of be bottom up in that sense, so individual focused, and then hoping that society would change through that. And I guess I'm also, in hearing these terms, I'm trying to assign them to left and right, which may not be what you're kind of hoping for, that might be the very tension that you're, or connection that you're trying to break in talking about this. And I guess I see policies that I associate more with the left that do focus on individuals but tend to utilize the government as like the governing body of society more, but then perhaps more right-leaning policies tend to focus on more maybe societal or moral issues. And so I guess I'm also trying to make that connection, which, is that a connection that you're hoping to foster through this conversation or trying to break?
Yeah, no, very good. Well, on this question of government activity, it's important to bear in mind that European conservatism was paternalistic and big state conservatism. The view was that the French Revolution and the Enlightenment and atomized society set people against each other. There was a lack of order. And so not only does the government have to instill and cultivate social order, but it's responsible for the welfare of society as a whole. And so, you know, the beginnings of the welfare state in the West were actually in, well, partially Tory England, but especially in Bismarckian Germany, and this whole tradition in Northern Europe of what's called corporatism, where the conservative state understands it has a responsibility to keep the social whole healthy, educated, and all the rest. And from that point of view, economic individualism is a radical liberalism that threatens to undermine everything in society, right? And so on the liberal side, you use the word hope, I think, correctly, because certainly from a conservative point of view, the focus, let's say, just on individual rights in this court case, protecting this fish that swims in this water, and you can come up with all sorts of examples, there is a kind of unexpressed hope or wish or faith, maybe it is, that somehow if we get all that stuff right, that the whole is going to be all right. But maybe that's just not the case, right? That separating things out by individual causes and individual actions and individual rights may just not make a whole, lead to contradictions, lead to things that don't get done, all sorts of things like that. So that is sort of what I was driving at. So,
Thank you so much.
sure, thank you.
So we have these 4 different categories, right? I'm curious where certain philosophies that might not particularly be able to be boxed in these categories might fit. So I'll use the example of libertarianism, right? There are folks that are maybe paleo-libertarian who are more socially conservative, but have these strict libertarian.
Let me stop you there because you're already violating the definitions of the terms I used.
Okay.
Okay, so just stick with libertarian without adding anything to it for now,
Okay.
if you can.
All right, sure. And we'll say like a philosopher like Murdoch, for example, where would libertarianism alone fit in terms of your 4 terms or your boxing?
Oh, well, let me just turn it around. What do you mean by the term libertarianism? If you're to separate it from thinkers and movements,
Sure.
how do you understand it?
I would say libertarianism it tries to attempt to separate politics from ethical or societal or cultural values or cultural terminology, say like liberalism or conservatism, traditionalism, etc., and tries to separate these maybe legal principles to other ethical principles in a way that the political side focuses specifically on either limited or no government or statism, as opposed to a plethora of different social ideologies, if that makes sense.
Well, what picture of human nature would undergird this distinction you make between a kind of hyper-individualism, which leads to a picture of limited government, let's say Robert Nozick, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, right, on the one hand, and a non-individualism in society that puts people under other sources of authority, or in situations where they don't cultivate their individuality. I'm not saying that people can't go to church, but you can go to church as an individual and go and leave. It's another thing to commit yourself to a church, raise your children in it so they think of themselves as being part of it. And that doesn't seem so libertarian to me, as I understand it. I guess I would use the term as the most radical, purest form of liberalism. But that's just me, right? That it because it only recognizes the standing of individuals. And then what happens, once they get together is sort of their business.
So you would say that libertarianism would be...
See, these things don't have an essence. I'm just, right? Because we're just trying to put labels on boxes. So I'm just saying that it's a word I would instinctively put on the most extreme where there's no eye to the rest of society. So you want to use it in another way, and other people do use it another way. You're right about that, Murray Rothbard and so on. So then my question would be, okay, well, what kind of picture of human nature, not just the relation of individual society, but human nature, undergirds this idea that you would make a distinction between things that government might be involved in and, let's say, other sources of social authority might be involved with, and that the former need to be limited or are not a priori kosher, while the other ones might be. So how do you think a Rothbard type might articulate that?
It's interesting. I'd have to think about it a lot, but I would say that from like a Rothbardian interpretation of libertarianism, I don't know if it necessarily, because his philosophy of human nature was more in line with a neo-Lockean, if you will, interpretation. So I suppose you could put him on the more maybe in a liberal box, or like how you reference a more radical utmost form of liberalism. So.
Okay, yeah, thank you, that's interesting. Oh, actually, there's someone way in the corner. You spoke a bit at lunch here. I'd like to get a new voice in, and then you.
I guess in my group, we kind of talked a little bit about how it seems like when both sides, how when conservatives and liberals were able to foster discussions and speaking, it seemed to do a lot better than when there was extremism, because when you look at historical events, that almost when you get onto the far end of conservatism, you tend to forget about the individual, and that, I guess, halts society in a way. But if you focus too much on the individual, society tends to fall apart, leading to certain revolutions, I guess, such as the French Revolution, among others. And then we also talked about economy a little bit, and how what is, I guess, it challenged our views of what's conservative and liberal in economy, because, or to me at least, in our political atmosphere, it seems that what's considered conservative almost focuses more on the individual in economy, and what's considered liberal in our political atmosphere almost considers society as a whole more in economy. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that and how economy plays a role.
Exactly. That's why we need new boxes and need to think about it, right?
Exactly.
Because, and not just because we want to be tidy, it's that we're not thinking through clearly what our picture of human nature is and what our picture of society is if we're cherry picking this way, right? So that I don't want the state to enter my bedroom and tell me what I can do, right? But I want the state to enter into what can be taught in my schools, how people are supposed to behave and other things, and be an activist state in other ways. And then, as you said correctly, on the conservative side, it also flips. You know, this term, if you haven't heard it, is called fusionism. It's one of these kind of politically alchemical terms that was invented in the 1950s by a man named Frank Meyer, who was an editor of National Review. And his argument was that, well, you know, people have always thought that capitalism means individualism, and that's hyperliberalism, and then there's conservative values, the family and all the rest. In America, it doesn't work that way. In America, the way it works is that capitalism, properly understood, actually shores up the family, shores up the society in all sorts of other ways. And if you believe that, I have a bridge I'd like to show you near where I used to live. But anyway, that's the argument, that you can have a kind of fusion. And that is broken down, interestingly. And it's broken down also on the right, because now there are people on the right who are culturally conservative and becoming anti-neoliberal and anti-free marketeer, arguing, for example, that we need an industrial policy, that we need worker training, given the world that, you know, the global economy that we're living in. And so the most advanced and interesting thinkers on the right for me are these people, because they're stepping back from this fusionist idea and trying to develop a more old-fashioned, certainly coherent and activist conservatism that would address the present. But once you start mixing these things up, you're just going to run into problems, policy by policy. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have this gentleman here and then,
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay.
none of these mics work, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you, and I really appreciate your definitions because they get at a core of a major problem in political discussion, which is like avoidance of first principles, and this, jumps down to them really quickly. And I think that's also a major limitation of them. I think it serves really well for like academic discussion and philosophical discussion and also tracking trends over time. But I would suggest that a limitation of that is in like pop culture political discourse, which is where I would suggest that it might be more beneficial to communicate your boxes by using the terms that have like naturally arisen in the common discourse, whether that's like MAGA Republic or MAGA conservatism or corporate conservatism. There tend to be more differences in the right than in the left. But so I would just suggest that in terms of the utility of your typology, it's very effective for like philosophic analyses of the past, whereas it might be more effective for trying to enact change in a political discussion on who we should elect or what policies we should push, to use more common terms that naturally rise through like the evolution of like social linguistics and things like that.
Yeah, well, I don't know, I'm skeptical of that. To begin with, all these terms that we use don't just kind of emanate from the bog. There are thinkers who use them. And they use them in a way that begins by defining them, and defining them for a reason, right? And so the origin is not just emanation, right? But what I'm interested in is us getting oriented in our heads, what we do about that afterwards. I mean, to my mind, what gets called the left today, and that's a moving thing, is really a jumble of liberals and progressives. And on the right you have conservatives and kind of anti-modernists, or people with apocalyptic views about contemporary world and society. So their right and left work for me, just as umbrella terms. But it's not like there's an essence to the right or left. Whereas liberalism, conservatism, and progressivism, and reaction, as I've described them, have an intellectual coherence. And so by thinking about that, it forces us to think through, well, in thinking about politics, where should one begin? Should one begin in thinking about analyzing human nature in relation of individuals to society? Or is really the political task to figure out what is happening in history? You know, we heard in the very first question very eloquently and really developed intellectually the view that history's the game, right? So understanding history, if you think of human nature as profoundly and only historical, then the question of a non-historical human nature makes more sense. So we have some thinking to do about the fundamentals of our political presuppositions. If we're just to get clear in our heads, what we do once, you know, how we speak once we go out into the public square is another matter, but we don't want that to feed back and confuse us, I think, and confuse the sort of springs of our action. How's that?
Yeah, I completely agree, and that makes sense. I just think that probably 90% of the population wouldn't be able to have a discussion at that level of like human nature and like.
That's why we're here.
Yeah, so from like
That's
from
why
like
God made us.
like a party like elitism, like sort of the elites of the party, it makes sense to have those discussions, but maybe not like when you're in. I think most political discussions are outside of that.
Right, they have the internet. We have one right here, if you want to bring the microphone around.
Hello, thank you. I'm going to preface by saying I'm not really a political science major or anything like that. I'm just here for fun. I just like to talk about these kinds of things. And I do agree with what Lunch Guy said, that there is a certain, I don't know his name, I'm sorry. There's a certain level of complacency amongst a good chunk of the lay people in terms of political knowledge and in terms of political coherency. And I want to talk about how that translates into extremism. I feel like we didn't really address the radical political ideologies enough in this sort of COP. And I was wondering, in terms of things like the radical right, as you discussed before, and as, I'm sorry, what's that? Lunch Guy.
Oh, Lunch Guy, Nathan.
Nathan, as Nathan would put it, these sort of MAGA conservatives would be considered a part of the alt-right. I was wondering, do you think that those sorts of movements would essentially cause, if it gains enough momentum, the rest of the lay people's consciousness to kind of awaken and kind of radicalize them as well into this sort of counter-movement if enough incoherency, enough chaos, and enough disorder kind of disrupts their complacent and sort of, you know, very idyllic lives. I believe that it was, I don't remember who said it, but it was, I don't think it was the dead Kennedys that said, to give me, what was it? Give me convenience or give me death. And I believe that that sort of statement really matters here, especially when these days real political change comes through the barrel of a gun. And I just want to hear about what your opinion is about, you know, reactionary movements as a counter-movement against existing radical political parties.
Yeah, to begin with, political change does not come through a gun now. It comes through ideas that motivate people to pick up, that motivate people to pick up a gun, right? But apart from that, you're asking exactly the question that we ought to move to, I think. And that is that, is there a difference between the, let's call it the threat level of debates between liberals and conservatives, and the threat level of debates between revolutionaries, revolutionary progressives, and reactionaries? And I think you can see that there is, given the debates over human nature and given that it's not a question of seizing history, the debates between liberals and conservatives, as I've defined them, tend to be about good reforms and bad reforms. Whereas when I grew up in the 60s and 70s and a little bit in the 50s, all the historical radicalism and apocalypticism came from the left, right? And so, either out of a revolutionary faith fed by a kind of Marxist myth of history, or just disgust at the kind of consumer society we've begun, or in Europe, the legacy of fascism, there was, a widespread sense that history had gone off course. And to put it on course takes radical action that requires destruction, and if it requires it, let it come. Because we're trapped in a kind of historical situation or process, and we've got to seize our destiny. Now that has shifted to the right. Now on the right, it's this view that ever since the city, I can't tell you how often I get lectured by squeaky little undergraduates with their voices breaking, doing their best to fight acne, who come up and tell me, "Sir, you've forgotten about the world we have lost from back in the 50s. And I was there, right? And so somehow this mythical idea of a past, which has some elements of truth, but it's not lived experience, is motivating people on the right, and even quite young people on the right, to feel somehow that a coherent world once existed, it's been lost, we know who the agents of that are, we're on a downward slope because of that. And so this is the Flight 93 election. Remember, Michael Anton wrote an article in 2016 in something modestly called the Journal of American Greatness at the Claremont Institute in California, arguing that just as the passengers on Flight 93 on 9/11 had to storm the cockpit to prevent the worst from happening, so we all have to hold our noses and vote for Donald Trump, because if Hillary Clinton comes to power, it will be the social political equivalent of 9/11. And this was a rallying cry, and he's still very active. He just left being a top advisor in the White House. And so it leads to a kind of apocalypticism, and it colors your view of everything that happens, right? So that things that just might be ordinary things, a new kind of hip hop or something, suddenly becomes, the opportunity to bring out the Sturm und Drang and the anxiety about where our culture is going. I hate hip hop, but that's not the point. That it becomes, and so every event in the present ends up feeding a kind of historical mythology and builds up a desire to act in a radical way, right? And now, in my lifetimes, it's shifted entirely from the left over to the right.
And to follow up on that, if I'm allowed to,
Sure.
what happened to the left? What's going to happen to the left? It feels as though the idea of progressivism has kind of stagnated a bit into this sort of, a very social movement, and there's a huge lacking in terms of anything that's, actionable in terms of pushback against the sort of radical right.
Sure. Well, to my mind, it's pretty obvious. One is the failure of communist regimes around the world. Secondly, actually the great achievement of the left in setting up the welfare state. And then seeing that, in fact, it wasn't enough, and that a kind of despair sets in our faith in the ability of collective action to actually change things. We've tried a lot of things. We've tried welfare payments, we've tried economic regulation, we've tried environmental regulation. And all these things have very mixed records, as things do in life. But to feel a kind of hopefulness, to be on the left and say, actually, there are all these things that we haven't tried that are just obvious. We just need to put our effort into it. That program isn't there now. The most radical version of it failed around the world, led to tyranny. And the modest version in the left was in the West was also tried with mixed results that a lot of people today aren't happy with. I'm happy with them, but a lot of people are not. So you can't conjure up you can't will yourself to be a left, and maybe at that point you got to stop thinking about the left and go back to fundamentals of this sort I was talking about, start thinking again about human nature, the relation of the individual to society, the limits of collective action, how government can and can't work, all of these practical, almost policy things, right? And think about what sensible action would be. Thank you.
Thank you.
No one, is there anyone here who, and I worry maybe I've stacked the cards too much, but I'm curious if there's anyone who would like to make a case that the view of social decline is actually important and we need that, it's the case, and secondly, we need to be aware of that to orient our political action. I don't know whether the audience, people in the audience are generally feeling optimistic historically or pessimistic, whether you all feel there's been some break in history, whether it's irrelevant. Have you not thought much about it? So you don't hear anyone talking on campus saying we need to make this a Christian nation again because X, Y, and Z. You hear the lot, don't you? Or knocking around. Well, obviously that presumes that somehow we've departed from that something has happened. And presumes that we then need to figure out what happened in history such that we're no longer the society we were. It's one thing to say we're not the society we should be. You can answer that question without appealing to what's happened in history. But to say we aren't the society we were, you made a historical statement. Yeah? And so those of you who might have made that, I just wonder if you can own it here and say something about that. All happy liberals and conservatives, history doesn't matter. I don't believe you.
I think that it's important to acknowledge a lot of different ways in which we could be said to have grown apart from one another. A lot of different ways that it could be said we've sort of entered a phase of anarchy, or I guess there's a quote by somebody, I don't remember who it is, but they said something like, one, the past is a foreign country. Two, the new age struggles to be born. We live in a time of monsters. I think this is my opinion as somebody.
It was Yeats. The poet.
Yeah, Yeats. Something along those lines. But yeah, as a left winger, I am not a right winger, but as a left winger, I think that the best representative of the right is, unambiguously, I think it's Nick Fuentes. And I think that...
I don't know who that is, so tell me about him. Nick Winton?
Nick Fuentes.
Oh, okay. How do you spell it again?
Fuentes.
Oh, Fuentes.
Fuentes.
Fuentes, sorry. Okay, right, okay.
I would say unambiguously he is the best representative of the right, because in a lot of ways he attracts the attention of left-wingers with his discussions of his very, very vivid descriptions of a decline of trust. He is one of these people who is very big on this idea of a high-trust society, and who is very keen on, very sensitive to a lot of the ways that not only in a multicultural society, but in a hyper-advanced capitalist industrial society, connections between human beings, trust, our willingness to go certain places in public or at night, and a lot of things like this. We have, in a sense, fallen from another time in history. Or we could look back and say that our society, was a better place for human beings to live amongst one another and to satisfy one another.
And when was that?
Well, to somebody like Fuentes, it would have been 50s, and in a sense, in a very limited sense.
How old is
it's
young
true.
Fuentes?
He's 26.
I rest my case. But,
Rest
I'm
your
sorry.
case,
I
really?
rest my case.
That's okay. Do I gotta keep going?
No, keep going, please.
Okay. So in a very, very limited sense, I think that as progressives, we need to be able to acknowledge the fact that the germ of perhaps a society yet to come is contained within a past that a lot of people still remember and that a lot of people would seek perhaps in vain, and certainly in vain, to reestablish. But that ultimately it would have to be a progression, a negation of the conditions, or an abolition of the conditions that gave rise to our present era from those conditions that would have to solve these problems.
Okay, thank you, yeah. Let me just remind everyone that it is possible to argue against a present state of affairs without invoking anything about history, anything about the past. You simply say, this is no way to live. We're not meant to live this way. We want to improve the way we live. And you don't need a fantasy version of the past, or even if it's not entirely a fantasy, an incomplete view of the past. Because the past not only is a foreign country, but it contains a lot of different, an infinite number of things that happened. Infinite number of groups of peoples, some of whose lives have been improved, certainly for women, in most of the aspects of their lives. And I want to ask the young woman who just screwed up her face. Okay. If I mention that there are more and more women in school, that they can now work in businesses with much less harassment than used to be the case before. If you talk to anyone who used to actually work in offices back then in the 50s, even look at movies about offices back in the 50s, that they get to think longer about when to get married and have kids and all the rest. Now, I can imagine that there are all sorts of things that are worse for women, and I could draw up a list there. Would you argue would you make the case that it's not a mixed bag?
I think it is a mixed bag. I just think that currently, this is my own opinion, that we are going back on a lot of things when it comes to women's rights, and just kind of like in general, and not just in the United States, but like all over the world, because yes, some countries are being able to have women get into power and have women be able to get an education, but at the same time, we're seeing people also go back and making.
Oh, I see. I misunderstood you. So you're saying we're backsliding.
Yes.
It's not that you're idealizing life in the 50s and 60s
Oh, God.
for women. Okay.
No, God.
Well, there are people in the audience I think who might.
Oh yeah, no, I, under no circumstance. I would
So
say-
you were screwing up your face in a left way.
Yeah.
Not the right way, okay. All right. Yeah, but again, just to say that, you know, to complain about something, to work for something, you do not need a historical story. Now, if you're a Marxist, if you're a Hegelian, you think you do to really understand what's going on. I'm arguing that, well, you ought to think about that. Because, it's really easy to excite people based on a view of history, of a period in history they did not experience. And it's not that you necessarily have a contradictory view of it, it's just it was messy. Family life was really messy in the 50s. If you look at statistics of children being beaten, alcoholism rates, people feeling despair in being in marriages they didn't want to be in, that too is there. You can talk about, in the past, you can imagine that there was more solidarity because people weren't bowling alone and they belonged to more clubs and things like that. But there were also fewer opportunities to just go off on your own. To begin with, the rise of individual sports as opposed to team sports is part of it. People go skiing, people go running, they do other things now rather than share them. So a lot of things happen in history. So one advantage of thinking in terms of liberals and conservatives is that they can have debates about the good and the bad without having to deliver a final judgment on the course of history.
Well, thank you. I do think that those of us who look at opinion surveys bear some responsibility for this sense that it was better in the past. Because we're always talking about indicators that have declined, right? So we're more lonely, we're less happy, we have fewer children, I mean, we go on and on and on. But that, those are trend lines, and they're not all the trends, right? There are other trends that are going in a different direction, or we can't measure them. So I take some responsibility for that and look back. Anyway, thank you, Professor Lilla. This has been amazing. Of course, there are more things we have to do as on discourse people. So that's your post-ODI survey. So now that you've learned so much, and I think we have learned so much. So as you're doing that, our next Tocqueville event considers religion and the American founding. Talk about looking back. That may be part of that myth-making as well. We're featuring two extraordinary scholars, Mark Lilla from Notre Dame and Caitlin Chess from Duke. And that will be on October 7th and 8th, and I'm sure you'll want to join us for that. And without further ado, let's give our appreciation to Professor Lilla. Thank you so much. And you're dismissed. Thank you all for coming.